Thank you. I'm really glad to be here. It's always nice to have an opportunity to present this work live and have a discussion about it, because often it sort of just happens in like a whole, and more so in the last couple of years. So this project, the thing that I'm going to talk to you about today, started in earnest around 2017, but it has a kind of more a kind of deeper origin in the kind of my graduate studies work when I studied at the Sandberg Institute between 2008 and 10. So this is sort of like long trajectory where I started this, kind of had this interest in the document and currencies and this kind of thing. Back then, the long hiatus, got in touch with Jeff, wrote this paper for the book, and that sort of like helped to revive this work. And actually, there's a book that's come out of this that's currently at the printer and is going to be out next week. So this is like partly Jeff's book promotion, but I'm also doing a little bit of mine. But anyway, like I was saying, the story of this project starts from when I was in grad school, studying at the Sandberg Institute. And of the two-year program, I went there thinking that I wanted to sort of explore or try to find a kind of interesting intersection between politics and graphic design. I was working as a graphic designer at a magazine, and as many of us, I think, of us here are designers, have felt sort of encountered the kind of alienation of that kind of work. And so I saw the kind of like connection to something more, I don't know, meaningful through the practice. So about a year and a half into this two-year program, I sort of stumbled upon this thing called alternative currencies, and thought, okay, this is maybe a place where I can explore this intersection. And it all started with a very sort of, maybe dumb or naive question, which was, why can't I design money? And in spite of this sort of like the naivety of this question, it has been since that moment a very generous one for me. And so that question is sort of in my attempts to answer that through sort of like traditional like bibliographic research and meeting people who are sort of engaged in these practices, and also in sort of creative studio activities. I began to try to answer this question and then confront the kind of limitations of graphic design in actually instantiating something like an alternative currency. And essentially, this program is stalled, and this project around currencies is stalled and sort of evolved into a kind of interest in documents. So more broadly, an interest in documents.
Oh, this.
Oh, is that a question? No.
Oh, this guy wrote an essay. Again, it's this cart before the horse shit that I just don't.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Cart before the horse. Yeah. So
where it's like, because graphic design designs documents. Hello, DocuSign. We don't even do them anymore.
You want to give the lecture? Who is that? Lorraine? You're not muted, Lorraine. So can I continue? Yeah. Okay. So so this interest in documents, the thing that I'm interested in here with regards to the document is the way that documents instantiate or give a form to claims that are essentially contingent, that are disputable, that might kind of deflect the possibility of the kind of imposition of or the kind of subversive alterity. And documents also mobilize what I call techniques of immutability, which I'll elaborate on more and hopefully satisfy some of the doubts, or at least address some of the doubts expressed very early on. Right off the bat, I'd love to have that conversation, but please wait till we're done. So the thing that I began asking myself as I entered the sort of pedagogical practice was, what if graphic design education centered the document? So what if we taught, instead of things like logos, instead of logos, books, websites, posters, these sort of genres, or a form? What if we taught passports, money, property deeds, birth certificates, marriage licenses, these kinds of, what if we taught these kinds of things? It kind of, again, maybe a silly question, but one that for me at least, has been quite generative. And so to sort of frame this foray, this sort of like speculative foray, one thing that I'd like to do is counterpose what I call a kind of imperative or mandate to immutability if one is considering the design of documents against what I think is the sort of like normative condition in design education, which is to orient studio pedagogy around form factors of, genres of form, sometimes I say, that advance a publicity agenda. So a kind of imperative to publicity, like how do you make things, how do you take a kind of inscription or a message, form that in such a way that it's able to be stored and transmit through mass communication technology and media. So like what, there's a set of formal conceptual concerns there that already imply certain kind of technological conditions. So I think we understand that quite well in again, the kind of normative, the kind of design pedagogy that a lot of us were trained in, a lot of us teach, but we don't understand this very well if we were to bring, again, things like passports, money, birth certificates into a design pedagogy now. So this is what I'm trying to sort of understand. Sorry, I said that. So there's a couple of ways that I think that this sort of imperative to publicity is instantiated in design pedagogy. At least a couple. I'll talk about two now. The first is the career outlook page or the school prospectus, which is the sort of the kind of initial phase that students or maybe more properly parents encounter when considering a kind of education in graphic design. And a lot of these sort of school prospect, if you go to these websites, they say a lot of similar things. This is OCADU, my alma mater. Students studio courses in practice such as brand strategy, motion graphics, typeface design, interactive communication. RISD alumni follow a wide range of paths, specializing in web interactive media, creating everything from package design to title sequence film and television, publishing film, television, retail, more. And MICA, companies have hired MICA designers for jobs at Abercrombie and Fitch, Cooper Hewitt, Google, MoMA, National Public Radio, Under Armour, Otis, strong craft and presentation skills. Recent employers include Apple, Anthropology, LACMA, Guess, Capitol Records. Right, none of this is like the IRS. None of this is the right, like the Medicaid, right? Design officer, principal designer, global head. All this sort of like aspirational projection for the parents, for the students. Students go on to work at BC. This is Emily Carr in Vancouver, Capcom, I don't know, right, Facebook, etc. Pratt Institute, where I work now. Students contribute to fields in art and design, publishing, education, film, gaming, advertising, many more. Again, like no IRS, no border security, etc. No sort of like state bureaucracies, right, that produce these documental artifacts that I would say are even more consequential, right? Maybe the most consequential sort of like graphical objects that we encounter on a daily basis. Another way that publicity is sort of, I think, inculcated in the design student and in the curriculum is through its historiography. And I take the example of Meggs's history of graphic design, which I think is the sort of de facto canonical standard. It's been translated into multiple languages. It's taught around the world. It's sort of, I think it's fairly established as like the canonical standard. I sort of borrow a critique from, or I sort of like take on the critique that Joanna Drucker makes of books like Meggs and what's the other one? Can't remember the name of it now. In the sense that these historiographies of graphic design tend to read or narrate the history of design as a kind of like teleological, techno-progressive kind of story that begins at the sort of like hyper local specificity of cave paintings and sort of like strings along or a kind of aligns or forms. Foucault calls it a kind of discursive formation in how one constructs a discourse or even maybe a discipline. A kind of alignment of like everything spanning between cave paintings and the internet, right? So the kind of hyper local specificity of a cave to a kind of global network communications infrastructure. And what this narrative arc essentially tells is that design sort of like plays a role in this sort of like universalizing mission, in this kind of globalizing mission that's driven by technology. But also this historiography is populated and modeled, Drucker says, uncritically on the methodologies, historiographical methodologies of art history, where accession into the story is roughly based on a kind of technical genealogy of masterpieces as this story's objects, created by geniuses or auteurs as this story's subjects. On the other hand, if we were to build a curriculum, a design curriculum around a concern for immutability, a concern for how to make documents protect their inscriptions against movement through space and time, but also against a kind of like alterity, dispute, doubt. That might entail a different sort of like methodology of accession, which I relate to this notion of studying up, which I'll elaborate in a second, where the things that exceed into the story are not the sort of masterpiece, but the banal document as its object. And these documents are constitutive. They make up this sort of like the subject of this history, which I sort of would cast in this role, the bureaucracy, and not just any bureaucracy, excuse me, but the colonial state and the capitalist enterprise as the sort of like the kind of hegemonic bureaucracies that run a lot of the shit today. So studying up is a notion that I'm borrowing from the American anthropologist Laura Nader, who wrote this text in the 70s, calling on her colleagues in the field to study up on those in power, because she argues that we, from the kind of relative position of privilege within the academy, have a lot of access to oppressed people. We have a lot of access to working class people. We have a lot of access to colonized people, and are able to produce a lot of knowledge about the sort of quote unquote subaltern. But the methodologies of study endemic to this discipline are ill-equipped for studying up on those in power. We have very little access to the places where the decisions that are made about the world are made, and very little capacity to produce knowledge about these spaces. So she calls on her colleagues to try to develop methods for doing this. So I kind of think about a kind of history of immutability as a kind of effort at studying up, a history of the document as a kind of effort at trying to understand how power works through a kind of banal, underexamined, even boring things that are, again, underexamined precisely because, in graphic design education, they don't help anybody get a job. Studying a passport is not going to help a lot of students get a job, right? So this kind of thing goes kind of underexamined. But this history that I'm proposing here is not meant to be a kind of history of best practices or a kind of ideal that one aspires to. Rather, what I'm trying to do here is to cast this history as an indictment, as a way to say, not like look how far we've come, but to say, look what they did, right? Look what they did to us. So before going further, what I'd like to do here is to sketch out some idea of what a document is. I'll draw first from the media historian Lisa Gittleman, who in her book Paper Knowledge Toward a Media History of Documents explains that the document performs a dual function that she calls the no-show function. So on the one hand, the document is a knowledge producing artifact, It performs and it produces an evidentiary function. So think about something like a passport. A passport produces knowledge of a subject, biometric information. It produces gender as a kind of knowable quality. It produces nationality as a kind of knowable quality. It produces age, identification numbers, date of birth, these kinds of forms of information as knowable. These things are all, of course, contingent, but they're instantiated in a kind of securitized document and therefore function or have a kind of stability that's proper to knowledge. They are also evidentiary. They perform a showing function in the sense that these documents are mostly dormant or inactive in a kind of like everyday sense, except when there's a kind of moment of controversy, right? You're standing at a border with, there's a line in the ground, which is a kind of another graphical artifact, a border. And on the one side of that border is a man or a woman with a gun. And if you want to cross that line, you have to show this person, this armed person, the proper papers, the proper graphical document, providing evidence that you have the right to traverse that space. And in this sense, Gittleman argues that the document triangulates kind of modern subjects, sort of modern individuals, in relation to a third party, the state, or some kind of authority. So there's essentially what this is saying is that the document is not like a discrete object. It's like to design a document as a graphic designer. It's insufficient to think about designing the document in terms of the sort of professional skills that we teach in our kind of current pedagogy. One has to also consider the triangulation of this piece of paper with somebody with a gun and the kind of authority that authorizes that person to use that gun if you don't follow the rules. The document is also a visualization or a kind of objectification. Drucker, in her book Graphesis, has this statement in the opening of the book: most information visualizations are acts of interpretation masquerading as presentation. In other words, they are images that act as if they are just showing us what is, but in actuality, they are arguments made in graphical form. I'm going to just rush through this. To the extent that documents inscribe or instantiate or actuate information, Jonathan Beller, the film and media theorist, writes that information is not ontologically neutral. It is constituted by the gaze that seeks it. This is me paraphrasing, actually. Information is constituted by the gaze that seeks it and is reified in documentary formats and can't be extracted from the capitalist logic of the commodity form, which violently transposes chicken lives to another domain. So he gives this illustration in his book about the way that the sort of like thick and complex lives of poultry, of chicken, poultry is the sort of like commodity word for the name for these things, are flattened and reduced to the scale of the glyph of this form that fits on a spreadsheet, that fits on a screen. In order for that life to be categorized, in order for that life to be managed, and in his argument towards this sort of murderous consequence. In other words, Beller is saying information and its schematization of the world imposes claims, right? Claims in these documentary instantiations that complex and thick lives are reducible to numbers, combinable, comparable units available to the murderous rationality of managerial calculation. Furthermore, information is distinct, is a distinct sort of category of a form, I would say, or that Hobart and Schiffman say, that is distinct because information is stable. So it's immutable, or the quality of being stable or immutable is what sort of certifies a claim as information. If it's malleable or unstable, it's disqualified as information. Latour, this quote, he asks, who will win in an agonistic encounter between two authors and all of the authors between them? It's the one and what do they need to build up a statement? The answer is that the one that's able to muster on the spot the largest number of well-aligned and faithful allies. This definition is victory. Victory is common to war, politics, and law. And in this sort of this quote from Latour, he, I think, evokes the graphical, right, alignment, gathering. I think, one immediately, again, for me at least, I think about the kind of like graphic phenomenon or category of the spreadsheet. Right, this sort of like really banal artifact that has determined so much of how the world is managed. So information helps, becoming information helps stabilize otherwise contestable claims. So another way, just one more point, to understand the document through what it is not, I think through the performance theorist Diana Taylor, who sort of pitches the document as being aligned with the archival. So Taylor counterposes the archival inscription to performatic ways of knowing, of holding and transmitting knowledge and memory. She's careful to not make these sort of like absolute binary, like the document is colonial and the archival is colonial and the performatic, or what she calls performatic knowledge production and transmission, is kind of indigenous, because colonial sort of entities and indigenous entities both had performative and kind of archival forms of knowledge production and transmission. But she does sort of talk about the way that the document or the archive has been instrumental in the kind of imposition of colonization and the production of coloniality. Am I okay for time? Yeah, okay. Oh yeah, okay. Okay, I'm just gonna really rush through this. Okay, good. So I'm just gonna, let's see if we can skip through this. So one of the ways that I've, in addition to, doing some sort of, I'm not trained as a scholar, I'm trained as a graphic designer, but in addition to doing sort of bibliographic study around this topic, I've also engaged in sort of creative studio practice in trying to like make documents, or trying to like embody the gestures, let's say, of making documents. So this is a coin that I had made that sort of helps me to narrate these various techniques of immutability that I've sort of come to, starting to come to as sort of categories, let's say, of techniques for producing immutability. So on the one side of this coin is an image that appears at the top of Hammurabi Stele. Hammurabi Stele, if you recall from Art History 101, is a sort of, according to the archaeological record, one of the earliest schedules of laws and punishments imposed by a kind of sovereign entity, as a state, let's say. At the top of this image, you see a picture, an illustration that depicts the sun god Shamash seated on the right-hand side, handing symbols of power to the king Hammurabi, who's standing on the left-hand side. And the inscription, the translation of the inscription that immediately underneath this image reads something to the effect of, "I, Hammurabi, a fallible human being, receive from the sun god the right to administer laws and punishments." So this is sort of an appeal to a divine authority. There's also the kind of inscription of this contestable code of laws on basalt stone that's about 2 meters high, immovable. You can't change the inscription here. It's made in stone. And then on top of that, there's an appeal to an entity that no one else can appeal to. The inscriptions are irreproachable now, right? There's a kind of ideological, a religious kind of appeal to this authority that you just can't mess with, right? You can't talk to Shamash. You can't try to appeal. So it's done, immutable. The other interesting thing here is the symbols. I tried to center this in the way that I positioned it on the coin. Some archaeologists regard this scepter and ring as symbols of power, as symbols of eternity. Other interpretations see this as surveyor's tools, a peg and a coil, used to measure out land, used to measure out property, right? So the kind of ultimate form of adjudication, or maybe even the kind of earliest form of reasons for the state to adjudicate anything, are land disputes. And so the sun god is invested with this right to define land property. The other side, the tail side of the coin, reproduces an inscription that reads, "To counterfeit is death." This is taken from early American paper money. And so with the advent of printing, another part of the story that I like to tell is about the way that printing is not a kind of literary, doesn't make a contribution to the kind of literary history, but to the bureaucratic one. Paper money, stock certificates, I think these are more important consequence of Gutenberg's press that we don't get to if we talked about the Korean and Chinese printing press. That's a nice kind of diverse, inclusive thing to do in the history. But I think it's more interesting and more consequential to like remain focused on the kind of problematic consequences of the European printing press, which again lead to the advent of the stock certificate, the joint stock company, the multinational corporation, paper money. And in the United States, paper money, the United States was the first country in the world to issue paper money to fund a war, right? This begins a kind of long history of the printing of money to fund warfare. It starts here, just before the American Revolution. The problem with printing paper money was that this technology was extremely vulnerable to counterfeiting or to overprinting, to kind of being undermined by the printer. And so again, here we see an appeal to an authority, but in this case, not a deity, but the state, which has the sort of claims the legitimate right to kill you if you cross the line. The sort of third surface on this coin is the edge of the coin, and it includes this feature what's called the reeded edge. And the reeded edge was sort of developed and perfected by Matthew Boulton, who was a British industrialist, a business partner of James Watt. It's not that well known that the steam engine was applied first, like almost the second application of the steam engine was for minting coinage. Before it was really used for factory production, it was used for pressing money. So Boulton was kind of early partner of James Watt and sought the application of the steam engine for printing coin or pressing coins that had a kind of morphological regularity and also was able to print essentially or press forms into the edge of the coin, because at this time when coins were minted in precious metals like gold and silver, there was a criminal practice called clipping, where people would shave or clip the edges of coins to extract some precious metal while retaining the face value of the coin. And this was a crime that was punishable by death. But to punish or enforce this is a practical impossibility. So they're required, it was deemed to be required that some kind of technological or formal something in the design would help to securitize the coin. So the reeded edge, essentially what it does is it functions as a kind of silent policeman, right? It functions as a kind of normative standard against which counterfeits or frauds could be detected. So if there was a reeded edge, if you had a textured edge, you could be fairly confident that the face value of the coin, the kind of graphical inscription of the coin was legitimate. If it didn't have, excuse me, if it didn't have that, then you ought to be suspicious. Okay, so to recap, first I posited that the conventional design education and practice is largely publicity oriented. To this, I counterposed a historiography of the document as a j'accuse, implicating design further in the development and persistence of the colonial state and the capitalist enterprise. This is not a history to mark out heroic examples and best practices, but testimony to be submitted as evidence of a vast crime. To the enemies of capitalism and colonialism, this is a call for imagining. I think this is a call, I imagine this as a call to imagine an antagonistic position to publicity and immutability. How might this come to be? Some very preliminary notes, something that I hope we can talk about. This quote from Fanon: the colonist makes history and he knows it. The history he writes is therefore not the history of the country he is despoiling, but the history of his own nation's looting, raping, and starving to death. The immobility to which the colonized subject is condemned can be challenged only if he decides to put an end to the history of colonization and the history of despoliation in order to bring to life the history of the nation, the history of decolonization, the history of decolonization. So what other stories, what other histories can be told? This is, I think, right, if we take immutability of the study of documents as a kind of a history of what they did to us, right? To say, this is what they did to us. These are the criminals. What can we do to them, right? What other stories can be told? I think this background is the ground against which another kind of pedagogy, one that's not going to help anyone get a job, one that's not going to help anyone's career, but maybe ought to be pursued as a kind of worthy question. What other stories can be told? The poet In Sung Kim, in her text Poetry Without Poets, calls for reasserting the centrality of emergent form in creative praxis against privileged declarations that art is dead or poetry is dead, against the foreclosure of emergence and asserting that there is still more to be said, more work to be done. This concern for form is oriented towards articulating that which has been unsayable and unthinkable against the banal managerial realism of neoliberalism. Okay, that's like very wordy, but basically, like, you know, like what I try to do in my teaching, that I hope approaches this is ask, especially for my thesis students, you know, ask them like what their essential question in thesis is, like, what are you making visible, right? What are you giving form to, and what are you making communicable that has been silenced or suppressed or maybe misunderstood? What is your role here, right? Not just to reproduce and remobilize forms that already exist, but like how can you give visuality or sensibility to something that has been, again, silenced or suppressed or misunderstood? So a renewed should I wrap up?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm like 2 slides away. Yeah. So a renewed antagonistic approach to design education practice ought to privilege emergence of form and facilitate speaking of that which has been unspeakable. Walter Mignolo might call this re-existing. The Brazilian thinker of pedagogy, Paulo Freire, might offers the concept of naming the world, giving a capacity to give discursive form to that community's understanding of the world as part of the vocation of becoming human. Ariela Aisha Azule calls for the rehearsal of what she calls potential histories, or to summarize or paraphrase very severely, the reenactment of worlds that have been shuttered by imperial histories. So study here might entail the revival of suppressed precedents. It might entail creative studio praxis, exploration of forms, storage, transmission of names that exercise a kind of oppositional agency. For example, what does a genuine and substantive material political reassertion of the name Lenape-Hoking, which is the name of this land, entail? The Lenape name of this land entail? For sure, more than the kind of liberal institutional DEI initiatives and verbal land acknowledgements. Could Freire's concept of naming the world give design designation a more critical charge? Could history, in other words, can design be oriented towards exploring and creating other ways of remembering and activating potential histories? Could historiography be about designing history in ways that involve new kinds of transmission and writing and storage? And to what point is it even useful? Let me move this around so you can see. To what point is it even useful to retain design as a disciplinary framework? And at what point must its institutional and professional horizons be abandoned to meaningfully explore these questions? I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.